Welcome to the Thinking Practitioner Podcast,
a podcast where we dig into the fascinating issues, conditions, and quandaries in the massage and manual therapy world today.
I'm Whitney Lowe.
And I'm Til Luchau.
Welcome to the Thinking Practitioner.
Books of Discovery has been part of the massage therapy and bodywork world for over 25 years. Nearly 3,000 schools around the globe teach with their textbooks, e-textbooks, and digital resources. Books of Discovery likes to say, learning adventures start here, and they find that same spirit here on the Thinking Practitioner podcast, and they're proud to support our work, knowing we share the mission to bring the massage and bodywork community thought-provoking and enlivening content that advances our profession.
And instructors of manual therapy education programs can request complimentary copies of Books of Discovery's textbooks to review for use in their program. So please reach out to booksofdiscovery.com, and listeners can explore their collection of learning resources for anatomy, pathology, kinesiology, physiology, ethics, and business mastery at booksofdiscovery.com, where Thinking Practitioner listeners can save 15% by entering Thinking at checkout. So, good afternoon, Til. How are you today?
Good
Or actually, it's morning
afternoon.
time. It's morning time still.
It's getting toward afternoon.
Yeah, it's afternoon
I'm
somewhere.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm well.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking. How about you, Whitney?
I am doing well also. What are we talking about today?
We're talking about an interesting study that came across my feed. It's called Relations Between Tactile Sensitivity of the Finger, Arm, and Cheek Skin over the Lifespan, showing decline only on the finger. A very descriptive title that kind of does give a spoiler to the study's findings that there is a decline in our tactile sensitivity in our fingers. And that was authored by, I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, Semena et al. And their team, published July 1st in Frontiers on Aging Neuroscience. We'll link it in the show notes, of course, to the original, but it had some interesting implications, I think, and started some interesting trains of thought in my mind, and I wanted to share those with you, Whitney.
Yeah, so tell us, what's the overall view? What did this study show?
Well, like the title of the study says, we get less sensitive as we age. This study found out, especially in our fingers. But they also monitored sensitivity, they didn't monitor it, they compared different age groups, but not in our cheeks, on our face, or on our forearms. That sensitivity was steady over all the different age groups. But as people were in the older group, they were less sensitive with their fingers.
Yeah, I learned in reading the study there, I learned a new word I hadn't been aware of before, of glabrous skin.
Glabrous skin, right.
Yeah, so that's the skin with no hair follicles in it.
Particularly like soles of the feet, palms of the hand. It's got thicker epidermis, it's got more mechanoreceptors. It behaves differently than other kinds of skin. And it's relevant to our practice, to what we do as hands-on practitioners, because that's where we touch people from.
Yeah, I think, I read that in the introduction to this study. I thought that was interesting. They did make a mention of a much higher percentage of mechanoreceptors and other things in that skin, in the glabrous skin that was not skin with hair. Am I remembering that correctly? Which one was more? Yeah.
Yeah. Meissner's corpuscles in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
I thought that was interesting. I wasn't aware of that difference in there.
Well, yeah. Right. It technically, it's kind of a little known fact, but intuitively it makes sense. I mean, our palms are sensitive, our tips of our fingers are sensitive, the soles of our feet are sensitive. That's why you can get tickled there.
Yeah.
People don't tickle your kneecap and have quite the same effect, different mechanoreceptors there. So yeah, sensitive, at least in the beginning of life. And the question is, what happens as we age? How much less sensitive they get? And does that impact our work? What implications does that have?
Yeah.
They checked it with what's called the von Frey monofilament test, where they have these little pieces of filament, like fishing line of different thicknesses, and they would touch the skin in these 3 different places and see how fine a line they could use and still have a report back of a sensation.
Yeah. This seems particularly relevant for, what we're doing, trying to find and discriminate, different subtle aspects of soft tissue texture for us. Because I know there's a lot of exercises in massage school and manual therapy schools about how to develop some of that tactile sensitivity. So
It's emphasized a lot in different manual therapy trainings for sure.
Yeah.
Osteopaths get a lot of training in that, and there's the stories. I mean, I did this in my craniosacral training of the phone book, using the thin pages of a phone book and putting a hair underneath it and tracing the shape, and
Hmm.
then putting more and more layers of phone book pages on there until you could no longer feel the hair. So we had a score. We had a tactile score there, number of pages, and we'd
Yeah.
compete in class to see who could get the most pages and still feel
Yeah.
the hair.
Curious about that. Did you feel like you ever improved from like an initial score? Did you get better at it over
Yeah,
time?
yeah. And especially there's another one where we'd have a blindfold on and there'd be like a treatment table or massage table there with a sheet on it.
Mm.
We're blindfolded. We have a hold of the corners of the sheet, and then someone would put a heavy book on the table somewhere, and only holding the corners, we'd pull in the corners and then point to where the book is on the table.
Ah, interesting.
And that was harder,
Hmm.
but with practice, that got better too. That's actually
Yeah.
quite hard to do.
Yeah.
And the idea there that we have a hold of in the cranial work, we have a hold of the head typically, and we're feeling and the thought is, the narrative goes that we're feeling through the fascial network to feel where these restrictions might be.
Yeah.
Bodily.
That is a fascinating concept because to me, at least when I think about that as being two very different sensory
Ah,
processes because one is
absolutely.
tactile sensitivity in the
Right.
fingertips themselves, and the other is a super highly refined degree of proprioception, feeling,
Yeah,
different levels of tension and muscles from angles of
that's
where
right.
something is pulling.
That's right. And then
And
being able to triangulate it from your two hands and
yeah,
make a guess, there's a lot of differences there.
yeah.
And so the question is, are those, what if those decline over time? Does
Hmm.
that influence our effectiveness as body workers? That's one question the study raises.
Yeah.
They also did what they called a spatial discrimination test in the study, where they checked their subjects' ability to feel different widths grooves in a plastic plate just by a very carefully regimented stroke over the surface of the plate. Could you tell the different size of the grooves? So yeah, we could imagine. I don't know about the filament thing. That's a little bit of a leap, but for sure the grooves and some of the other things, we can imagine using those skills more directly in manual therapy.
Tell me how I have a sort of an idea what I can think about. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the groove thing you think would translate into what we do
Well,
in manual therapy.
size. It's you were asking me to discriminate which of these grooves is bigger.
Hmm.
They give you two plates. And I think being able to perceive the relative size of things and compare them
Hmm.
accurately, I'm making the case that it's important. I'm also later in our discussion going to make the case that maybe this isn't so important, just by the way.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But let's say it's important. Yeah, I could see that being able to discriminate small differences in size uh, would make me more accurate, give me more accurate information. Maybe I'd be able to perceive things I couldn't if I was trained there or sensitive
Yeah.
there.
Hmm.
Yeah, I should also mention here that Robert Schleip and some collaborators did a study related. It was at the same time that the Berlin 2018 Fascial Congress was going on, and they recruited people from that conference to participate in that, different osteopaths and practitioners that were there. And Barch is the lead author, Barch et al. 2020. We'll link that in the show notes. And they didn't check these things. They checked stiffness. They had these silicon gel um, squares of
Hmm.
different viscosities or thicknesses, resilience. And then they were checking your ability to determine which was the stiffest and least stiff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they were trying to make that even more directly related to what we feel in manual therapies and body work.
Yeah. In thinking about the groove experiment there,
Yeah.
I can see a direct correlation with things like degrees of fibrosity in tissue where you're trying to
Okay.
feel like do kind of stringy orientations of a particular myofascial tissue that might indicate scar tissue or some type of
Uh-huh.
adhesion or something like that. That feels like it definitely has an orientation when you pluck or strum across it in one direction, but not in another. That
Okay.
could be something where those grooves would make a difference. But this also made me think too, um, it would be interesting to see what would be found in a study like this because they were using direct contact with the contour surface to
Right.
test it. But that's not ever what we do or I don't know, not
Uh-huh.
ever, but rarely what we do. We work through a medium, the
Yes.
skin, to feel things that are underneath it. So it would be interesting to see
Yes.
what might be felt in those tactile investigations if they were having to also work through another medium to try to feel what's down below that.
That's right. That's right. I'm remembering now some games. We'd have these touch Olympics, we called them, when I
Uh-huh.
was training at giving trainings at the Rolf Institute in the training that I headed up there. And we put different numbers of blankets or sheets or pillowcases on the table, and then the game was to count them. How many layers are there?
Oh
So that
yeah.
you're
Uh-huh.
feeling through these layers and trying to
Yeah.
determine how many layers you're feeling through, all kinds
Nice.
of
Yeah.
things. All
Yeah.
right, so let's talk a little more about why the authors think this decreased sensitivity happened. There's a lot to talk about here, but let's go through it and make sure we understand their picture of it. They're speculating that the decreased sensitivity in the fingers over time, over age, happened because uh, of deterioration, basically, of the mechanoreceptors.
Hmm.
Nerves do age, and that's one reason like neuropathies and things like that are more common in older people, especially in the feet, because that's the longest neurons in the body, and they maybe are most sensitive to age-related degradation.
Yeah. You got to
So,
wonder too about mechanical compression of those over time, just because they take a beating, especially
mm,
in the foot when you think about
mm.
the weight loads and the compression loads that they are subjected to over time, in addition to the length of those nerves.
So just wearing out, just fatigue, you
Yeah.
think, tissue fatigue. Yes,
Yeah.
the structure of those is really, they each have a little different structure, and that's related to some of the signal they generate, like the pacinian corpuscles around your joints in your hands that help you sense grip strength,
Mhm.
the grip force rather, are like little onions. They're layered, and as the pressure pushes the layers of onions together, that transduces the signal, it produces the signal that your nerve perceives.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
maybe, yeah, who knows if the mechanical qualities of those onions change, then they'd have a different signal generating capacity.
And I'd be willing to bet that there's some different degrees of adaptation if you compare those in the hands versus those in the feet, because I would imagine
Right.
over the
Yeah,
millennia that we have probably adapted those proprioceptors to some degree to be able to
sure.
respond to the compression levels there.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why we have all these grip sensors around our finger joints, but not many other places in the body. They're very adapted, very local.
Yeah. Mhm.
The other thing that was interesting to me about this study, I mean, one of the reasons that was interesting to me about the speculating about the change over time was loss of tissue hydration. And yeah, our tissues are less hydrated as we age. And they cited a couple of other people's studies that showed that using a moisturizer cream improved the spatial discrimination scores, both immediately
Oh,
after
really?
immediately after you use the cream, but then they did a group where they had them use the cream for a month and their overall scores changed too. So it's like a long-term thing.
Oh, interesting.
So just
Huh.
keeping your hand tissue hydrated seemed to increase your sensitivity quite a bit.
Yeah. Huh. Okay. So, and hey, those of practitioners who spend all day long with their hands in lotion and lubricants working on people might have some
There you go.
offsets to the age-related degeneration then.
Maybe there is an argument for us getting a hand cream sponsor, Whitney.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, maybe there's something there.
Yeah.
And then they didn't mention this in the study, but I had heard about it and they referenced it in the study that there's also a lot of central processing changes that happen over time. Meaning your central nervous system, your
Yeah.
brain, the descending processes change. So this is a study, Goad et al. In 2018 found that top-down processes, meaning ones that were determined by your brain's ability to process or ability to facilitate or inhibit signals, was stronger. It was changed more over time than bottom-up signals. The signal from your hand didn't change as much as your brain's influence on those signals changed with age.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
I hope I said that clearly enough.
Yeah.
But they say it's tactile performance changes over age are mainly caused by a decline of central perceptive evaluative capacities rather than by reduced sensitivity. So basically, it's our brains that are getting older too,
Yeah.
they're saying.
And I guess that was going to eventually take us back into that question of like, we know everything degenerates with age. So how important is that and how much does it degenerate? I think those probably end up being some of our big takeaway
Yes,
questions. Yeah.
that's right. How much and how important? That's good. Let's
Yeah.
let's get there.
Yeah.
Uh, should we talk about implications for clients
Mm,
first?
yeah. Yeah. That's a good next step here.
Yeah, they weren't thinking about body workers when they did this study. They're thinking about tactile research into people with diminished sensation over time and how that might influence their activities of daily living or
Hmm.
treatments or therapies they engage in. And for sure, as a person, you if you have reduced sensitivity in your fingertips, that could make it harder to do buttons, zippers, work devices, phones, things that require a degree of dexterity. It's also, they mentioned this in the study too, decreased postural feedback from the feet. If you're generally less sensitive to tactile input,
Hmm.
that can lead to more falls. You have poor balance. You're not adapting as quickly or as accurately.
Yeah. And that seems like that could compound the other difficulties that people have as they age with balance challenges as well.
You can imagine that,
Yeah.
yeah. And then they didn't mention this, but I know about it. I know you know about it, but less tactile sensitivity correlates with more pain. People that have chronic pain have less tactile sensitivity,
Yeah.
or
Do we know
refinement,
why
let's
that
say.
is?
There's probably, yeah, I remember reading some very technical explanations for some of those mechanisms involved, but in general, I'm just going to give you my probably way oversimplified way I think about it to myself.
Mhm.
And that's when there's a lot of noise in the system, it's harder to hear anything.
Yeah,
And that's, like if you're dealing with a lot of pain experience, you're not going to notice a little monofilament touching your fingertip as
exactly.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of back to
And
the cortical smudging
yep,
concepts of the difficulty of precisely identifying and narrowing down on where those sensations are coming from.
that's right.
Yeah.
This is an interesting reference in this study. They referenced Zamorano et al. In 2015, who studied musicians of high-level classical musicians who were really good with their dexterity, had really good sensitivity
Hmm.
too in their fingers. And they were asking, is this m more related to pain or less related to pain? Did musicians uh, have it worse than other people who weren't musicians just because they were more dexterous?
Hmm.
And their takeaway was basically they do. Uh, the more dexterous you get, the more sensitive you get in your fingers, the more likely you are to have chronic pain too.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Huh.
Sensitivity cuts two ways, you could
Hmm.
say.
Interesting.
So, yes, the more tactile sensitivity you had in that study, the more likely you were to have chronic pain. And that kind of makes sense. I can see that because sensitivity just means your threshold for sensing something.
Yep.
And if it's lowered, you're gonna have more of all kinds of sensations,
Yeah.
including
And you
pain.
may be tuned into things a bit more
Mhm.
significantly with that increased dexterity as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
You mentioned the cortical smudging thing,
Mm.
the 2-point discrimination test.
Mm.
I guess it's a bit out of favor now. It's pretty unreliable because there's so many variables there, but the basic principle is um, if you're in pain, you need 2 points to be much farther apart to tell it's two.
Hmm.
If you're not in pain, you can tell it's 2 points even when there's 2 points of contact are close together.
Yeah.
So basically, your refinement is reduced when you're in pain.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting thing, though, and this is the basis of a lot of what I teach. So I'm hanging my hat on a tenuous hook here. There hasn't been a lot of research in the ability to diminish pain by training tactile refinement. We know they're correlated, but we don't know that if we change one, that changes the other.
So explain that a little bit. So when you talk
Yeah.
about tactile refinement, tell me a little bit more
Okay.
about what you're
So
thinking
let's
there.
say you could practice with 2-point discrimination
Hmm.
and get really good at telling if it's 2 points or one, even at a closer distance, more refined.
Hmm.
There hasn't been a study that I know of, and the people I've asked that know of, that say that makes your pain go down when you learn that.
Hmm.
So a lot of these things we know about pain are correlations and assumptions about the causality, there hasn't been a lot of study done into how we actually change it and if we can change it using this knowledge.
Yeah. Right.
Now, in my bias, informed may perhaps or influencing perhaps my clinical experience, yeah, when people get really refined about their body awareness, their body sense, pain is a whole different animal. It's much less bothersome typically.
Hmm.
So there, certainly I have some empirical evidence of my own and experience that says, yeah, as I get people more refined in their tactile or proprioceptive sensitivity, all the body sense in general, pain is diminished and easier to manage.
And why do you think that is? Because it seems like the more body sense
Yeah.
that they would get, it would seem like the pain might ramp up.
The key word there is more. It's
Mhm,
not about more body sensation, it's about refining it.
mhm,
So that when I can get really accurate about what I feel, exactly where does it hurt?
mhm.
Where does it stop hurting? What else in my body doesn't hurt? When I can feel all those things, the painful experience has a different context. Otherwise, it just takes over my awareness and smudges the whole screen.
Yeah. Mhm.
If I can really study, and this is the same principles as mindfulness-based pain reduction, things like that. If I can really pay attention to exactly how it hurts, where it hurts, and then also what doesn't hurt, the pain itself changes because so
Yeah.
much of the pain is a reaction more than a signal.
Yeah. That's interesting to think about it because I remember reading this, I think in John Kabat-Zinn's work many years ago, discussions of methods of what you were talking about with mindfulness, pain
Yes,
reduction, of
yes.
trying to focus on this. And I had learned this exercise. I don't even remember whether this is actually before I became a body worker. This like I was early 20s, maybe late teens or
Uh-huh.
something like that. Somebody turned me on to this exercise of a way to alleviate headaches, and they were talking about just um, taking some time to, quiet the mind, think about, just try to stop thinking about things, but give that pain a texture, a
Mm-hmm.
color, a smell, and
Mm-hmm.
just like zero in on it as much as you can as a sensation and try to ascribe
Mm-hmm.
all of these different characteristics to it. And the more you focused on those characteristics of it, the less it got in intensity.
That's right.
Which was interesting because it seems like, the more you'd focus on something, the worse it might get. But no, it seemed to have the reverse
No,
effect.
it's the type of focus. It's
Hmm.
that inquisitive focus about its qualities. It's refining, like you said, texture, color, shape, and perhaps size. And a lot of times if you ask someone how big their headache is, they like spread their arms apart. It's huge.
Yeah.
And then when
Hmm.
you point out that actually wouldn't fit in your head, something that big,
Yeah.
that right there is like a mind blower.
Yeah.
So then they actually go in and study it. Okay, actually, how big is it to me spatially right now? And as they get more present moment based and can feel the actual experience, it changes that whole reactive process
Yeah.
around the pain, and the pain often diminishes.
Yeah.
So, should we talk about body worker implications of this study?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the gist of why we're here. So what does this
Yeah,
mean for us?
couple of interesting trivia points that lead us up to that. I talked about the phone book exercise and some of the others, but these are things that we uh, told each other in my training process there, and they're accurate. It's true. Automobiles are manufactured to tolerances within a thousandth of an inch, and
Mhm.
these really fine micrometers, little devices, and different kind of gauges to measure the parts when they're manufactured to make sure they're within tolerances.
Yeah.
In aerospace, airplanes, rocketry, things like that, the tolerances are a tenth as small, that 10 thousandths of an inch.
Yeah.
And the hands turn out to be more reliable indicators of a match between two parts than micrometers when they
Mhm.
get that small. A machinist can feel a 10 thousandth of an inch difference where a micrometer can't.
Really?
Yeah. You
Huh.
can just run your hands across the seam and you can tell do they match or not.
Yeah.
And a micrometer might be within their margin of error.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah.
There are
So I'm
some,
curious to
uh-huh.
know if they're doing this in the aerospace or mechanics industry. Do they have people actually touching this stuff as
This
their
is
determination?
This is what we were told each other. Somebody brought this story to us, and we latched onto it and told each other this. That's actually these aerospace machinists are using their hands to check their work all the time.
Wow.
I don't know if that's true or not,
Yeah.
but there is good research that kind of tried to narrow down what's the smallest thing a human finger can feel, and it turns out to be reliable differences at 13 nanometers, which is pretty darn small.
Mhm.
The comparison there is if your fingertip were the size of the planet Earth, you could feel the difference between an automobile and a house on the planet Earth.
Huh.
I don't know if you get that make sense at all, but you can just
Yeah.
imagine something that scale. We can feel tiny, tiny little differences in
That
things,
is a very, very small difference. Yeah.
much smaller than the actual mechanoreceptors involved.
Huh. That's fascinating.
Okay,
Yeah.
so again, these are the stories that we help us support our idea that tactile accuracy is an important skill, and it probably is.
Mhm.
But there's also some skepticism about that. Is tactile acuity really necessary to do good manual therapy?
Yeah. So I think the question would become, it's one of those gray areas, like how much of that will you use? Just like your brain, we
Uh-huh.
got an incredible capacity, but how much are we really going to use of it?
If you're really sensitive to these small little nanometer differences, is that going to make you a better body worker?
Yeah.
And because the argument goes, if those differences are really so small, do they make a difference to function
Yeah.
or experience at all?
Yeah.
If we're feeling these small little differences in shape or texture or viscosity, and they're that small, are they significant?
Hmm.
The argument being that they aren't in
Yeah.
that case.
This also kind of gets to the crux of a lot of the arguments about inter-rater reliability in certain types of assessment strategies that involve palpatory investigation, like SI joint movement or things like that. When some people say they can feel something and other people say they can't, like how
Yeah,
how
that's
relevant are those things?
well, that's the argument that's used to dismiss a lot of the hands-on tests is that there's
Yeah.
very poor, we're not really good on most tests
Yeah.
of matching someone else's results or even matching our own results on the next day on the same situation.
Yeah.
So we're not very reliable, and that's brings this tactile acuity thing into doubt in terms of its usefulness from
Yeah.
that point of view.
Right.
And those are good points,
Hmm.
for goodness sake. It's really good to question, do we really need to be that sensitive to do good work? Um, and I'm of two minds of it. I don't know. What do you think? What are your different minds of this? I'll tell you mine, but you tell me yours.
Yeah, I would have to say for me, the way I would look at this, it's one of those gray area things that
Yeah.
getting better at sensitivity is, I
Uh-huh.
think, helpful and beneficial
Yeah.
up to a point at which, like there's a point at which your improved sensitivity is probably not going to make as big a difference. Like the early jump of just not doing anything to really training it and trying to get better at it is going to help you. But that sensitivity increase later on down the road becomes less and less beneficial. Um, so kind of like there's
That
an
makes sense to
analogy,
me.
sort of like I remember a couple of years ago I was looking into getting a new stereo system, and I could not believe what some of these high-end stereo people were telling me about what people were paying for speaker cables. And
Yes.
it's like you can buy speaker cables, a really good quality speaker cable for like $40, and there's people that pay $300 for cables. I'm like, really?
For that
Uh,
last little increment of
yeah,
possible improvement.
but the difference in sound between a $10 cable and a $30 cable or $40 cable is significant, but it's going to take somebody really highly specialized to tell the difference between a $60 cable and a $350 cable. So,
Well, significant is subjective, isn't it? And that's what we're
oh
talking
yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm like that with my coffee. I'm experimenting lately with the difference between a 15-gram cup of coffee and a 16-gram cup of coffee.
Oh, that's a small difference there.
It's a small difference, but I can swear I can
Wait, now
taste it.
what is the
That's the
characteristic? Is that amount of coffee that you're
that's the amount of
drinking, or is
coffee.
it
No,
okay?
that's the amount of coffee beans I grind.
Okay.
Yeah. And the 16 cup just has that little extra bit of bitter on it.
Wow.
I enjoy.
I'd like to see the taste test done on that, like the blind taste test,
Yes,
and like
exactly.
how
I
good is
that
he?
that's on
How
my
good
list.
is he really?
I want
Yeah,
to check myself too.
yeah. So what do you think? I mean, pertinence,
Uh
relevance for this.
yeah, like I said, I'm of two minds. One is it's fun and it is a great skill to train. And I like I said, I trained a lot of people in this kind of sensitivity and used that in my thinking for a long time. And there is value there. But it's a quantitative value. we're like seeing how many pages of the phone book, or we're seeing like what's the smallest microfiber that can be detected or the smallest groove. Those
Mhm.
are all numbers, and that's what you need to research it. But I don't think you get good a good experience in your client from a purely quantitative point of view. It's more the qualitative
Uh-huh.
touch that makes a difference.
Yeah.
And that's not the same. You don't have to be able to feel two more pages in the phone book to have a really amazing qualitative touch.
Yeah.
And I think the qualitative thing is a is related to how much actually we listen.
Yes.
Not so the sensitivity, but what we actually how we touch and how if we take time to really hear
Hmm.
and pay attention to and then respond to what we're feeling.
Yeah.
So it's that ability to actually hear it and then to actually let that change what we're doing that makes a much bigger difference to me than how small a thing we can feel.
Yeah. Yeah. I would definitely agree with that. Yeah. That the quality of that experience is going to, because one of the other things that's very different here about what we do compared to this particular study is this study was really a one-way evaluation of the individual's capability to feel a discrepancy.
Yes.
Doesn't have anything to do with necessarily how our clients experience the nature of our touch, which is what you're
Right.
kind of getting at too when you talk about the
That's right.
quality of it. And that's another big factor. So, I
I
mean,
can
there's
make
even
the
an
argument
argument
that,
that I
oh,
was
go
going to say
ahead.
there's an argument for saying like, I mean, and this would be a really good experiment. Somebody who has maybe
Hmm.
even like a prosthetic limb, but has learned how to touch in a very caring and compassionate way, comparing that client's experience of a device touching or something touching
Uh-huh.
non-human tactile sensation done with care and compassion versus
Uh-huh.
something else. So
Yes.
it gets much more complex, I think, when we start talking about the impacts on our clients.
Well, yes. And I can see that getting really trained in sensitivity could make your touch qualitatively better. You
Yeah.
can tell when someone's sensitive and when they're not.
Hmm.
But it's not because you know they're sensing your fingerprints or whatever. It's because they're really listening. They're paying attention.
Yeah.
So that's the key one for me.
I'd like to ask you this as a teacher, since you do this, both of us are in this realm a great deal because I see and feel this experience from students frequently. And I wonder, like, have you found a good way to teach the concept of that caring, compassionate touch? Because sometimes when I'm trying to share or teach massage techniques, I can just watch somebody's hands and
Mhm.
see how almost awkward they look in terms
Oh
of that
man, yes,
experience of somebody feeling something. And I was just like, I try to think of like, what is it that I'm trying to get across here about the subtleties of the smooth, caring, compassionate
right.
touch process that you're just not getting,
That was the question that got me into teaching. I was like an evaluator at the Esalen Institute. They go find anybody they could to get on the table and get a student massage to evaluate these students that
Yeah.
they were turning out. So they grabbed me and I was on the table and got different massages from different students, and some were so good and
Yeah.
some were so not good. And they'd been through the same training program.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so that really started me to think, can this be taught? How do we teach it? How do we get those people to really feel and respond and listen?
Yeah.
And it's an open inquiry here 40 years later. I think, how do we teach it was your question. I think it's hard because it does involve slowing down and people
Hmm.
just have a clock speed that they're moving at.
Yeah.
And it's really about, and it's still for me at this point, I mean, so much of what I learned through my wife's process of toward her end of life process recently was that it meant slowing down to be with her. And the touch was really important part of her care toward the end. But it was a whole different touch from my side. I talked about this some on an episode with her too. But
Right.
that continued where I had to really listen at a whole different level
Yeah.
than I had at any point
Yeah.
in my career to that point.
For me personally, I think one of the ways that I learned that as a practitioner and also tried to teach
Tell
it
me. Yeah.
as a teacher was studying Tai Chi.
Ah,
And that whole process of some of the interactive exercises with another practitioner that have a lot to do
mm,
with listening to the movement or the intention of a movement or something like that, and being able to just keep a very light touch in contact with
Yes.
them, but feel where they're going, where their balance is, where their weight is, and all that kind of stuff. And that
Interesting.
you can't do that when you're stiff. When you're doing
Right.
something with rigidity and sort of you've got to be that flowing water process of letting everything roll right over you, but also listening to it and responding to it at
Mhm.
the same time.
And the whole body being part of that, the whole body
Yeah.
listening, that
Hmm.
fluidity throughout the body.
Yeah.
Because hands aren't the only way we listen to our clients.
Indeed. Yeah.
There's the texture, there's resilience, the heat of the tissue, but we're also using our eyes, our ears, our
Yeah.
intuition, our empathy, our heart. All
Hmm.
those things are listening to our clients.
Yeah. So I'm curious too. Let me just tap on this for a second because you did mention at the outset that there was a discrimination between lost sensitivity in the fingertips, but not lost sensitivity in
Yes.
forearms and cheeks. And I know,
Yes.
especially like with a lot of the manual therapy and myofascial work you do, there's a lot of forearm, elbow, and non-fingertip type of
Interesting.
technique things that
That's
you do.
true.
Do you feel like there are also similar ways that of what we've talked about with the fingertips of enhancing that sensitivity in other body parts that we use to work with, forearms, elbows, knuckles and things like that?
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah. Can we enhance the sensitivity of other parts of the body? Yeah, I do use my forearms a lot. I use
mm,
knuckles a lot. Uh, there's, this idea of the sensory homunculus. We did an episode on that, the part of the brain that's dedicated to sensation, processing
yeah.
sensation of particular body parts. The hands are huge. They take up a
Hmm.
lot of real estate. There was some research, there's been a couple different versions of this, but there was some research that showed that it changes really rapidly as people change their use patterns. That the trained sensitivity is basically more of the brain being recruited to process the sensitivity from that hand.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And that there were observable changes in a period of 2 weeks in the study too.
Yeah.
I could tell someone who they did it with musicians who stopped practicing, and within 2 weeks their brain maps matched a more average map. And when they went back to practicing, they went back to this much bigger
Wow.
left hand. In this case, the
Huh.
violinist's left hand was the one that
Yeah.
got much bigger because they
Yeah.
were doing this delicate finger work on the fretboard.
Yeah.
So yeah, I imagine that I'm training different parts of my brain when I use different parts of my hand.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think there's an interesting, your point is interesting. We don't typically use our cheeks as tools in the body work, but that's a spot in the body that did not change over age in this study, and the
Yeah.
forearm.
Hmm.
It was steady throughout the age groups.
Yeah.
And if, I'm just speculating here, but if those places are related to the idea of pleasant touch, the C-tactile afferents that have more impact on the insula of the brain, which is evaluating, is this pleasant, is this unpleasant? You familiar with that concept? I mean, we probably
Yes,
talked about
but
it.
let's
Yeah.
let's elaborate that for the listeners a
Yes.
little bit. So,
Okay, there was this afferent touch idea that came out maybe 10, 12 years ago that says that there's a whole other class of neurons that are perceiving stimulus that the brain is mostly making value judgments on rather than sensation judgments. It was saying, is this pleasant? Is this not pleasant? More
mhm,
than, is this sharp or warm or
right. Uh-huh.
deep or whatever. And that these Z-tactile afferents, these neurons, are located in hairy parts of the body.
Hmm.
So like the backs of the arms, the head, different places, the beard zones and on our face, those kinds of things. The argument being that they were probably social grooming reward circuits.
Mm.
That
Uh,
if we liked being touched there, we were more likely to seek out that kind of touch from each other and more likely to have our ticks picked off, and so more likely to survive and produce offspring that also liked being touched there.
yeah, that is fascinating. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
So maybe we don't lose our equipment to enjoy touch.
Hmm.
Even as our fingertips diminished in sensitivity, maybe the backs of the arms, our cheeks, etc., are still really have the same degree of sensitivity when we're young because that's such an important function to be
Yeah.
receiving that kind of pleasurable touch, even
Yeah.
as we age, or maybe especially as we age.
Yeah. And I think hopefully that concept is not lost on listeners here for recognizing and translating that into what gets done in the treatment room with people every day. That whole social grooming process, and that exactly what you're referring to there is a reinforcement of that entire process that can be a significant part of people's positive experiences of manual therapy work.
And shifting someone's experience is just as therapeutic, maybe more therapeutic many times than shifting the physical qualities of their tissue.
Yeah.
So that's the other major idea here, is that if we assume that what we're doing is mostly tissue change, then this small significant might mean something. If we include the fact that we're doing much more than that, then it's disproportionate and significance gets even smaller.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked before on this episode in a couple different, couple of our different episodes about that degree of tissue change. The ideas around how much of that is really happening seem to be shifting and changing a little bit underneath our feet in the current research as time goes on here.
Yeah, a lot of us are including more factors in our thinking than we were 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, and just should we do our takeaways here?
Yeah.
About to slide into mine.
Yeah.
You want to start? You want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead and start, and then I'll.
Okay, so the study showed only small changes over a lifetime. It's linear, meaning it didn't wait to the end and drop off. It's gradual from the early 20s when they're studying the subjects to into the 60s. But the amount of change was like 1 Newton meter. It was from like 4 Newton meters to 3 Newton. Well, it was somewhere between 3 and 5. It's a logarithmic scale, so it's hard to tell. Anyway, it's a small percentage change. So maybe we get less tactily sensitive to monofilaments, but it's not that big a change. And maybe over time we get much better at listening and responding and more patient and all those kind of things that more than make up for the mechanical sensitivity changes.
Yeah. I think, I agree with a lot of those concepts and the takeaways here. I think it's a fascinating idea to look at, but probably the degree of change that we see there is not something that is going to be tremendously noticeable to a lot of people over that longer period of time. And I think it's something we can probably, like we said, are there some ways that maybe we can make up for that lost sensitivity that we might have? That's something, I was thinking of this too, like this study looked at people that were aged, if I remember correctly, 20 to 75, I believe is what it was, the age range in there. But it was really a short duration of that intervention, and didn't really get a chance to look at what was the degree of change in each one of those individuals over the course of their lifespan. So, that would be a fascinating thing to see. It's like, how is that rate of change in each individual?
And they didn't follow individuals, they compared age groups.
Yeah.
So the assumption that all age groups started in the same place might be different too. Maybe people born a long time ago were born with less. We really don't know.
Maybe those people who were 75 and did too many drugs in the 60s lost their sensitivity when they were 30.
There's a few confounding variables in there. That's right.
Yeah. Yes. So anyway, all right. Well, that was a fascinating inquiry there, and I thank you for bringing this study to our attention. And some great things for us to think about, and also, keep our minds oriented to, like, this is something we don't talk about a lot, but I think, tactile sensitivity is something that we could work on and make ourselves better at with what we're doing with treating people. Yeah. And
the how we touch too becomes the overriding growth edge for all of us.
Yeah.
That patience, that listening, what we do with the information we get, those kinds of things.
Right.
Well, let me thank our sponsor, our closing sponsor. The Thinking Practitioner podcast is supported by ABMP, the Associated Bodywork and Massage Professionals. ABMP membership gives professional practitioners like you a package including individual liability insurance, free continuing education and quick reference apps, online scheduling, and payments with Pocket Suite, and much more.
And ABMP's CE courses, podcast, and Massage and Bodywork magazine always feature expert voices and new perspectives in the profession, including those from Til and myself. Thinking Practitioner listeners can save on joining ABMP by going to abmp.com/thinking. So thank you again to all of our listeners for hanging out with us and lending us your ears for a little bit. You can stop by our sites for the video, show notes, transcriptions, and any extras. You can find that over on my site at academyofclinicalmassage.com. And Til, where can they find that for you?
That's advanced-trainings.com. If you have comments, quibbles, kudos, anything, questions, things you'd like to hear us talk about, just email that to us or record a short voice memo on your phone and email that to us at info@thethinkingpractitioner.com, or look for us on social media. I am at Til Luchau. Whitney, where can people find you?
And I'm also on social under my name, Whitney Lowe. You can find me over there as well as our YouTube channel. And if you will, please take a moment out to rate us on Apple Podcasts. It does help other people find the show, and you can hear us wherever you happen to listen to your podcast. So please do share the word, tell a friend, and we will look forward to seeing you in the next episode.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Whitney.
All right. Thank you.